before we have questions, I just wanted to make one remark, just to point out the obvious. There's a way in which both presentations are connected through that final graceful line of Rich Crawford's, because Lecture on the Weather is, of course, an explicit claiming of legacy in the American past, namely Thoreau. And that is, to a certain extent, a performance of historical lineage, meaning it's an actual gesture or theater through which Cage claims a legacy in the American past. There is another question, namely, whether that claiming and the larger project of Cage places him in the vast open spaces of Walt Whitman and so forth, and how one would want to describe the idiomatic space that somebody like Cage occupies. So there are two questions, which of course then with this wonderful presentation can be referred back to some of the composers who are with us, namely on the one hand, a claiming of legacy in something like the American past, and second of all, a sense of place, whether it has been significant or not, and after all, not just the American past. We don't want to be exceptionalist. Surely Webern and Varese and a whole lot of other people are there as well, and Stravinsky and lots of other things. America is a modernist, cosmopolitan, and global place, but the presentations are related through this question of legacy and inheritance. I just point that out. Now maybe we have questions and comments and discussion. When we do, there is a microphone, and it would be good if you could raise your remarks into the microphone so that it can be recorded. Who would like to start? Maybe some of you, or Lita, please. Lita, since you're right here, rather than coming down. Lita, why don't you do this?
Well, just to talk to Rich Crawford for a minute, I was thinking as I was listening to your presentation and how the influence of these three mentors shows so strongly in your own work, in your interest in breadth as with Hitchcock, and you're looking at the larger pictures, larger gestures through music history a la Finney, and certainly when the clarity of your writing and avoiding jargon as Hans David would have wanted you to do. So it was really wonderful to hear you talk about these three, and then think about the wonderful way in which you've enriched music history for all of us and become a model for all of us. And I also just thought maybe following up, it would be very interesting to hear the composers talk about the influence of Finney or are these other faculty members as well on their work, and how Finney's teaching might have influenced their own creativity.
Yes, also the extent to which it was positive as opposed to negative terrain. Do you want to pursue that? But we have a couple of things on the table. Do some of you want to pursue that?
Could I go back to the very beginning of this thing? When you spoke about sort of a nostalgia for radicalism in music and everything else, I want to just say that from my age, I know it's true of Gordon. I heard it in Roger's piece last time. I grew up in the age of I.F. Stone, The Village Voice, my father and mother coming through the Depression, that kind of thing. I was trained in radicalism. Now, that apparently with our, like the vulgar prosperity of a place like the University of Michigan. I mean, vulgar wealth of the university. The kids are not, nobody would have that idea at all. So you're not going to get you're not going to get something like that because you can't teach it. In other words, if you want novelty, if you want, we as in our modernist history, we are sort of bred to like novelty. Everybody wants the newest thing. It's like news, right? But that news gets flattened out when everybody has the same thing. So if you want revolution in the humanities, if you want revolution in music, you have to teach revolution in other aspects of your life. Teach kids not not to accept anything. I mean, to be performance radicals in their life. They have to be in trouble. You have to teach kids that it's valuable to be in trouble all the time, and that kind of thing. Does that make any sense?
Absolutely.
Can I
Absolutely. Marjorie, you want to respond to that?
I actually would like to argue with that just a little bit and say that that isn't what I got. I do think our talks were very closely related, but in a different way. I was thinking as I was listening to Richard and I went to graduate school at just that time, how different things were. When you said American music was barely studied yet. And I remember the heyday of the new criticism, where of course literature was very big, but entirely different, and you don't think you ever heard the mention of anybody like John Cage. And I mean, the conclusion I would draw much more is that the academy has its own ways, and the things we're talking about, including ones, are non-academic. They by definition, W.H. Auden once told me that when he was teaching at Berkeley, that he couldn't even believe that they taught new poetry or his poetry or anything like that. That he really thought they only ought to learn Old English in graduate school. But the point is, what we're really talking about here, I think, is not teach them all the radicalism, because they're still in a university situation, in a classroom, and that isn't, you can't expect radicalism, I think, to come out of that in that kind of way. It's going to be very indirect, isn't it? I don't know how other people feel about that, but I can't imagine that it does, and that's why people are often very disappointed today, now that we have, all the poets have become academics, artists often also all teach, everybody teaches, and so it's fine if it's in art schools in some ways, but when it's in the regular university, it means quickly a kind of flattening out in some ways. How radical is it going to be when it's taught and there are exams on it and so on?
I want to return this right to you all. Rather than responding, I want to return it because it suggests to me that, at least from your point of view, Mr. Ashley, once was more political than others have said, actually. And it would be nice to hear more about that. Let's yes. Go ahead.
I just wanted to ask one question which has to do with the concept of symposium. Because the topic of the symposium today is the Once Festival and the Once Group. And as I've been listening to the presentations of major figures like Cage and Tudor, and then a presentation about the University of Michigan, in terms of the overall form, these are the figures which are sort of giving, figures and institutions that are giving the form to the topic. And I'm wondering if then we're supposed to surmise that the Once Festival and Group is content that fits into this. And I'm having problems with that as an idea. It seems to me that one issue at stake here is the role of the University of Michigan in the Once Festival and the Once Group, and what part it played, and then also, so in other words, town and gown, these kind of issues, and I would like to know more about this.
Yeah, let me just, I'm going to just say one thing peripherally, which is, let's also remember Michigan is now very keen to, I'm proud of the fact that STS was formed here at exactly the same time, and the Peace Corps and stuff, but all of that stuff was formed at the edges of, and to a certain extent in conflict with the University of Michigan, as was the Once Festival. Let's also remember that edge, actually. And in fact, part of the problem with the University of Michigan is that there's no opposition within the university anymore, and that has to do with the larger corporatization of the university, if I may say so.
I loved going to college, and I don't think college would be much different now than it was then. I loved it because I loved to go into a room and have a person older than me tell me very important things to me. But at that age and with that little experience, I couldn't recognize, or it wasn't even important that I recognize what now at 80 seems to be a lot of platitude. In other words, whatever you think about it, the platitude is very valuable when you're 20 years old. It's not so valuable when you're 80, but there's nothing wrong with the university as such, but that lever, that influence that you have on 20-year-old people can be, in our society, it's the only way to have a change toward benevolent socialism. There's no way that we're going to get any compassion for any other people on any other level of society except from the university. You can't get it from the media. You won't get it. Can only come from you. You have to teach people what you want them to believe.
I think Roger Reynolds wants to say something, right? Isn't that?
Yeah, to go back to what Bob said at the beginning, and there are a lot of threads in the air here. I think a lot of this has to do with how a university, which is a resource, a physical resource, and a collection of individuals who are performing functions which they may see differently, as Rich's talk made very clear. I remember a student that I had at the University of California, San Diego, and I was having trouble with, let's say, the issue of vibrancy in his work. And one day, in frustration, I said, "Have you ever done anything you would be ashamed to tell your mother?" And he took a while and he said, "No." I said, "That's the problem." Now, you know, a university, like any other institution, can be used by those who inhabit it. And I think the wonderful thing that Rich's talk illuminated was how significant the differential use that these three faculty members that he referred to made of their opportunity. I think describing myself for a moment as a professor, which I generally detest doing, the use that we make of our opportunities has a lot more flexibility and space than is often recognized, and you know, et cetera. So I wanted to say that in my presentation this afternoon, I'm actually going to refer to a seminar that Gordon gave at UCSD. And the relevance of this is that the first question he asked the members of the seminar was, why did you get into music, or how did you get into music? And the appalling truth that came out as we went around the room was that not one of the students mentioned the name of another human being. And this told so much about the nature of that generation and their self-absorption. And to me, so much of what we need to be aware of is the legacy that we owe those from whom we learned, and that learning may have been, in the case of the figures that Rich mentioned, especially beneficent. Sometimes, of course, it's violent, really difficult to take. Finney was, in addition to being volatile in a classroom, he could also be devastating, not because he was an evil man, but because he always said what he felt directly. And a lot of people, he ceased going to the Midwest Composers Symposiums because he would leave the students in other schools like Iowa or Illinois totally shattered. Not by design, but just because he spoke about music and their work in ways that none of their professors would ever have dreamt to speak. So I wanted to really commend Rich on the drawing of attention to these three remarkable faculty members. There were others. For me, for example, Oliver Adele was that way. He was in a different way. In any case, those three meant a lot to me also, and I'm sorry to go on, but that legacy of personal connectivity from one thoughtful human being to another is, for me, where it all is.
I think Matthew Perloff has a question.
It's less a question than just a comment that follows up on Lita Miller's comment. I was fortunate enough to study with Richard Crawford. And there's one class in particular, which was a lecture class, Euro-American Folk and Pop, right at Burton Tower. And it had an incredible influence on me. Actually, I'll mention two things. That class is really what inspired my dissertation, because it was the first time I was inspired to look at popular music. I was a art music, you know, and not that there need to be distinctions, but it encouraged me to go look at cabaret music and cafe music and to get onto a topic that considered how art composers like Eric Satie, Francis Poulenc were in that world of not only French popular music, Parisian, but also American popular music. And under Rich Crawford's guidance, then in my dissertation, I was able to do a chapter on specifically the influence of American popular music on Parisian French composers of the kind of post-war period, but very much influenced by the Gilmore Band, the Sousa Band, performances that were written up in the paper. And let me then add to that, and I hope this comes through from Rich Crawford's training, what he then gave to us as students, was this incredible scholarship, meticulous turn to primary sources, to spending hours at New York Public Library or the annex where you could look at the newspapers and read about Gilmore's performances right there. And this meticulous scholarship coupled with an attention to writing that made me cringe as I looked at comments where I knew my writing was awkward and clumsy and too elaborate. And Rich Crawford always said, shoot for the shortest, most simple word. And I always think about that as I write now. So I just want to pay my own tribute to a professor who made a huge influence on my career. Thanks.
Great. We have time for one or two more questions. We will stop at 1 o'clock pretty sharp because Laura Kuhn, you are all invited to lunch, as you know, and Laura Kuhn will be giving a presentation. So, but we have time for one or two if somebody would like to.
Be as brief as possible here. Two of those, thank you, Richard, for bringing up those three people. Two of them I connected with all the time. Wiley Hitchcock was opened a lot of doors for me, and just intellectually and culturally, it was extraordinary. Even in the days when musical examples were played with 78 RPM records on these old, yeah, that was the way it is, right? For the other part is my admiration for Ross Finney, with whom I was in constant conflict. He was very generous, always invited me to things, even though I had dropped out of the music department. He kept inviting me to associations and parties and the like, and get to here and join us, get in the crowd. He was very good that way. And I learned I was very young. I started here when I was, I think, about 16. I still wasn't 21 years old before I became to realize that the irritation factor of conflicts with those people like that, being irritated, was one of the great nourishments of my persona, of my ways of thinking. Irritation. Finney irritated me, generously always invited me, and it took a little while in my ending of the early adolescence to realize what a gift that was. One last brief thing. We have here the University of Michigan mentioned time after time. It's an extraordinary international university. But as I will mention later this afternoon, I think of the whole huge milieu around, which leaks into Detroit, down to Toledo, across to all of that. It included all of that. University of Michigan was just one of those things in the middle of this incredibly culturally active town, Ann Arbor. Little town was it then? It seemed like a huge place to me, and it still is, of course. But the entire community energy was very important. That's what we got away with by doing the Once Festival. We didn't, the conflicts with the University of Michigan were secondary. We had all the other resources around, and that was another important aspect. The bricks and mortar edges didn't stop us from our concept of moving on.
You're all invited to lunch. We will have just across there. We will have just a minute. We will have a presentation by Laura Kuhn during lunch. And I want to thank both the speakers for wonderful presentations. Thank you, Marjorie Perloff and Rich Crawford. Thank you.